Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be going over some code structure and some proper techniques and tricks to use when you're developing code in Flutter to keep as closely aligned to the standards that Flutter has established, or I should say Google has established for Flutter, and staying as close to that documentation as possible. So we're going to go over a couple things from the naming of files and folders to variable names, to formatting your code and simplifying trees that get really deep. We're going to be going over string interpolation and a couple other little tips and tricks to help improve the quality of your code. So let's get into it. So one of the most important things that you can do with your code is organizing your lib folder properly. I've seen a lot of projects where it's a complete mess. And it's difficult to follow, difficult to understand what's going on and what's being referenced where. So there's a couple of tricks and tips that I'll give you guys to help organize your lib folder a little bit better. The first big one is to break out your content, all of your Dart files, into separate directories or packages. And so there's a couple key ones that you should have, and we'll go over those ones. Let me just change that. We have our main.dart. And then I typically call it views, but I've seen it called screens as well. But you should always have a package or directory where you're storing all of your actual tangible views that you have in your app. And so for me, I break it out even further. I have an authentication package where I store my login and register screens. I'll typically, if I have an admin side to the application, I'll create an admin folder. If I have a side of the app that I only show to users who are paying a subscription, I will set that aside into its own folder as well. And breaking it out in these sections helps you know what's where, and it's much cleaner and easier to follow. In addition to that, we typically set up a theme folder, and what that stores is your main app theme file. And in my case, I also put my routes, I put colors, anything pertaining to the theme, I'll throw in this theme folder. And that's just so it's easy to reference, easy to find. Yeah. The next folder that I typically create is a net folder, or I've seen it called services as well before. So typically you want to put a folder where you have all of your methods for calling your backend services, your backend APIs, database, all of that. Anything referencing Firebase, if you're utilizing Firebase or Firestore, all of that I typically place into a net folder. And then I typically have a model folder, and the model folder simply stores all of my classes that I utilize, my model classes. I've also in the past, I have done components folder for small components. I've created widget folders for widgets that are generic and used in multiple places to help break out my code a little bit further. You can go as far in depth with this as you want, but a general rule of thumb is to at least break out your files into views, theme, model, and then some kind of folder for anything referencing backend. So with the naming of folders and files, what you want to do is any files that you have, you want to make sure everything's lowercase and that you put underscores between words. So in this case, main underscore list, map underscore view, menu underscore screen. Actually, this one I should refactor to be view. That way it's consistent with the rest of my views. And so these are some things that you can change and do to make everything consistent. And honestly, main list is also a view, so I'll call it main list view. And this way it's much easier to read, much easier to understand. Auth is good, login, opening register, that's good. And then my folder names, I always want to keep lowercase. When it comes to naming variables, what you want to do is you want to use lowercase camel case. And so you can see here, lowercase camel case simply means you always start with lowercase letter for your first word. Everything in that variable name is lowercase, but anytime you have another word, you capitalize in camel case those other words. So I could have another var called this is an example of lower case camel case, right? And so that's the kind of convention that you want to follow. That's the norm for Flutter. When it comes to classes, you want to use uppercase camel case, and that is okay. Let's talk about tree structure here. Now, typically what you want to do is whenever you finish off utilizing a widget, you want to make sure that you have a trailing comma, even if there's nothing else just after it. And the reason why you want to do this is you can see here, this is just a mess. It's just this big stacked blob. But when we use Flutter's formatter, you can see here when you put those trailing commas, it knows to structure it like so as a tree. I have Android Studio turned on to where it shows me exactly what widget is trailing each comma. And so this is another thing that also helps me see where I can put things. So I can see here, oh, right here is the last item in my row, children. And if I wanted to add another item in there, I could just, add it right in. Another thing you want to do is, where possible, you don't want to get too crazy with this, but when you have trees that are super deep like this, you can see I'm going about 10 to 12 items deep. It gets pretty difficult to read. And so sometimes it's a good idea to, take this padding, for example, cut it out. We'll give it a name, padding bottom. And then above, we're going to create a final padding bottom equals boom. And then paste that in. Now I'll have to refactor this to accommodate that product, but you can pull out sections of your code. That way your tree doesn't get too deep. And I could do this for each of the other paddings. And that way it looks a lot cleaner. So at the end of the day, it would look something like this instead of, Control Z here, instead of this big mess. This can get a little difficult to read. And the reason you want to do this is it's just easier to read code. So that way if you're looking through and you want to identify what's where, you can just skim over the things you don't care for until you get to what you're looking for, and then go up, find the final where it's being referenced, which I just got rid of, but find where it's being referenced and then look at it. So that's another thing that you can do to help clean up really deep trees. The next thing I wanted to go over with you guys is string interpolation. So a lot of people, I've seen this a lot, and it's really tacky, and honestly, I used to do this a lot as well. When they're trying to insert a string variable somewhere inside of another string, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll put a string, they'll put plus, they'll put the variable name, or they'll put the variable name .toString if it's not a string, and then they'll put another string. And this is just bad. This is a bad way to do this. The better way to do this is, let's say we have a string called good. It's called var. This is a good example. This is a $, brackets, reference good, example how to interpolate. And this way, we don't have to break it up into chunks. We easily and cleanly fit it right in. This is the correct way to interpolate strings. The last thing I want to go over is keeping your main.dart file as clean as possible. So what this entails is, one, don't ever put your opening view underneath your my app or whatever you want to name your main class. It's gross, it gets confusing, it gets ugly. Break it out into another file and start your app in that other file, and then reference that other file in your home. Don't define your routes directly under routes in your material app. Break it out into another file where you define all your app routes and reference it. And same goes for theme. Although it's fine and it's not necessary that you do this, when you start really getting into a complex and big app, it's going to get really messy and you're going to spend a lot of time refactoring if you don't do this from the start. And so what you should do is break out your app theme, break out your routes, break out your first view, and it'll make your app a lot cleaner. And again, I store both of these under app theme. And another thing that you can do as well, let's say that I reference all 3 files in my theme class. I can create another file, let's call it theme.dart, and I can say export package theme app theme.dart, and I'm actually going to copy this, paste it, I'm going to do colors and routes. And what this does is now, instead of referencing both of those files, all I have to do is reference that one file, my theme file, and it'll have all of the information it needs to access everything else in the folder. And what this is called is it's a funnel file. I've heard other names for it as well, but the important thing is that it allows you to reduce the amount of imports that you need to call in classes that utilize multiples of items in that package. And so same goes for net. Let's say I call multiple different APIs, I call my Firestore methods, I call all of that in one single class. I could create a file that exports all of those files and only reference that file. And it cleans up the number of imports at the top. You can see here, this is starting to get kind of big. I've got, 7 imports. I can reduce that. This one in particular I can't reduce. It's mainly packages that I'm importing, but I've seen files sometimes where I've called 3 different files in my net folder. And so by creating those files with all those exports, it greatly reduces the number of imports. And so those are just some last tips and tricks that come into my mind to help clean up your code and make it better formatted for large projects. If you find this video useful, please click that like button and subscribe. If you have anything you want to add on, other tips and tricks that have helped you with your development, by all means, comment below and I'd love to hear them.